So before I begin, I want to highlight how devastating the failure to pass last year's budget request is to ensuring our national defense and global security. Congress's inability to pass the FY24 budget, holding back much-needed funding, hinders our ability to execute that strategy. The department has no way around that reality. Instead, we have been strapped with a series of continuing resolutions. CRs are a significant constraint on our ability to advance our defense strategy, forcing the department to operate with one hand tied behind our back for months out of the year, even as we confront new and evolving security challenges each and every day. We cannot continue this cycle of continuing resolutions. This year's FY25 defense budget request at $849.8 billion would build on and advance generational military investments we've put in motion over the past several years. For the fourth year in a row, our budget furthers our goals to defend the nation, take care of our people, and succeed through teamwork.
The Pentagon's budget request for fiscal year 2025 is out, and it looks like services will have to tighten their belts. The Pentagon is asking for about $850 billion for the Department of Defense, which is slightly less than last year's number if you account for inflation. And here is some of what the services are seeing. The Army's request increased by $400 million from last year's request, and now it's at $185.9 billion. The service says it's prioritizing readiness and personnel matters. The Navy is seeking $257.6 billion for the Navy and Marine Corps, and it will request building one Virginia-class submarine instead of two. The Space Force is concerned that its $29.4 billion request, which is $600 million lower than what it asked for last year, will make it tough to keep up with space threats from Russia and China. Defense News and Military Times reporters pored over the budget requests. Here's some of what they found.
So the Army has come out with yet another flat budget of $185.9 billion. That's just up $400 million from last year's FY24 request. Here in FY25, I think some of the major areas that the Army will be funding, a big focus on personnel, $70.7 billion. They're going to be spending nearly $1 billion on barracks at 9 different sites. It's a huge priority for them, up 41% over last year's funding for barracks. That's $935 million. End strength is still down. They're planning for a budget of 442,300 active soldiers. That was down from FY24, which was 452,000. And the Guard will again be at 325,000 and reserves at 175,800. So still relatively low, and the Army is continuing to kind of inch down in terms of what they're expecting for an active end strength with each passing budget as they continue to struggle with recruiting. 2 major cancellations expected in the FY25 budget when it comes to modernization. The first already announced, already out there, but the Future Attack Reconnaissance Aircraft has been canceled in favor of funding procurement for UH-60 Blackhawks and CH-47 Chinooks, as well as unmanned aircraft systems to help fill in that role. And the Army's decided to cancel the Extended Range Cannon Artillery Program, or ERCA. That's a 58 caliber gun system that they were developing in prototyping phase, but it had a lot of technological issues. And so the Army's going back to the drawing board to look at what is out there in terms of fieldable systems. They plan to go this summer and take a look at what industry has to offer there. The requirements still exist. It's just the prototype wasn't working, so they're going to be canceling that program. In addition to some of the other modernization efforts, there's a big focus on integrated air and missile defense, as well as munitions. A lot of the munition increases, however, will be funded in a supplemental. Hopefully that passes. The Army is really anticipating the passage of something like that in order to fund some of the work that they're doing. But they are going to be buying quite a bit of missiles in FY25, $1.2 billion for Gimler's rockets. That's probably the biggest buy that they've made in many years. 230 PAC-3 MSE missiles, as well as 230 PRISM missiles, which are the brand new long-range ATACMS replacement. So that's coming online. Quite a few new missiles coming online, as well as a mid-range capability missile. So to recap, the Army is working with, yet again, a flat budget, and we're seeing a decrease in research and development funding, a rise in procurement, and a major prioritization when it comes to recruiting, as well as taking care of people through major housing and barracks improvements.
The U.S. Navy is looking at a pretty flat budget for fiscal year 25. They have a $257.6 billion top line, which is only a 0.7% increase compared to the 2024 request. Due to the tight budget nature, as well as ongoing operations in the Red Sea and a concern that there could be conflict in the Pacific in the coming years, the Navy is very focused on current readiness and any systems that could be fielded in the next year or two. And so as a result, under this tight budget, the Navy is postponing a lot of future development and modernization programs. For example, the FA-XX Future Fighter, which is part of the Navy's Next Generation Air Dominance program, is actually being pushed back quite a bit. In 24, they asked for $1.5 billion for development, and in the 25 budget, they're only asking for $500 million. Really an example of how tight funding is right now and the extent to which the Navy is looking to prioritize current and near-term priorities and being forced to delay future capabilities. There's also a large unmanned surface vessel that the Navy had planned to start buying in 2025. That's actually seeing a 2-year delay for similar reasons. It's an unmanned system, which the Navy is very excited about. However, it's on the larger side. It will take longer to build. It will take longer to get it into the fleet. And so because this isn't a capability that can affect operations overseas right now, it's not something they're willing to invest in, and they've pushed that back by 2 years. Another way the tight budget manifested itself is in the undersea profile. The Navy says that they are heavily invested in undersea capabilities. However, they were expecting to buy 2 submarines in 2025, and they've only purchased 1. These are the Virginia-class attack submarines, and the Navy's been buying them at 2 a year since fiscal 2011. So they've talked about the importance of buying on this regular cadence, the importance of having stable funding for industry, and yet, because of the tight nature of this year's budget, they are only buying 1. However, the Navy says that they are not going to disrupt the supply chain. And in fact, they are asking for $3.9 billion in fiscal 25 and $11.1 billion over the next 5 years. Not even for submarines, but specifically to shore up the supply chain. So this submarine industrial base investment money would go to not only the prime shipbuilders, but all of their suppliers, all of their vendors, all the folks that make pumps and circuit cards and everything that goes into a submarine. That's where the backlog in submarine production is. And so this money is really looking to help them expand their facilities, to hire and train new workers, and to take other measures to get their production rate up. Ultimately, the Navy wants to be buying at least 2 a year, but industry can't deliver that quickly right now. And so the Navy is choosing to postpone the 1 submarine in 2025, but invest in the industrial base to have long-term gains so that industry can eventually produce the required number of submarines. One of the big challenges the U.S. Navy faces in the 2025 budget is ongoing operations in the Red Sea. When the October 7th attack in Israel happened and the subsequent Houthi missile and drone attacks throughout the Red Sea region began later in October, the 2025 budget was actually almost all the way written and vetted higher up in the Department of Defense and the White House. And so this budget being released actually does not account for the higher rate of using missiles, the higher rate of using surface ships, such as destroyers. It's not accounting for all the ship maintenance that will be required when those ships come back from their deployments. And so the Navy has actually raised the idea of needing to request a supplemental spending package to Congress at some point later on in the coming months, because the 2025 budget just doesn't account for the current operations that they're seeing. There was supposed to be in fiscal 2024 a larger supplemental package that would cover operations in Ukraine, in the Middle East, as well as some things to prepare for a possible fight in the Pacific. And that bill still hasn't passed yet. And so that makes it even more important for the Navy to try to work through some of the details with the Office of the Secretary of Defense and then with Congress to figure out how they can get some additional funding for current operations. To recap, the U.S. Navy is facing an essentially flat budget in a time of great spending needs. As such, they're focused on current readiness and tomorrow readiness, and anything that affects future modernization, future capabilities, anything that won't impact today's operations, the Navy is choosing to defer that spending and focus its money on what it needs to fight overseas today.
The Air Force is requesting a fiscal 2025 budget of $188 billion. That's $3 billion more than their fiscal 2024 budget, but at a 1.6% increase, doesn't really keep up with inflation, and top service officials made note of that. They were constrained by the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which caps spending increases throughout the government, including at the Defense Department, and Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall made it clear that meant that there were a lot of trade-offs they had to make. The Air Force ended up proposing a budget increase for research, development, test, and evaluation of about $1.5 billion, bringing it up to $37.7 billion, but procurement would fall by $1.6 billion to $29 billion. And we saw how that's going to play out in some really tight aircraft acquisitions. The number of F-35As is procured in 2025 would shrink from the expected 48 to 42. F-15EXs would go down from what they had anticipated 24 to 18. So the Air Force is facing a constrained budget environment. They're getting a little bit more money, but not enough to keep up with inflation, but they've also still got to prepare for what could be a possible war in the Pacific if China makes a move on Taiwan. Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall said the service is trying to strike the right balance between near-term procurements of aircraft that could fight a war in a couple of years, but also investing in capabilities that might bear fruit in years to come. He said it's necessary to strike both the near-term and long-term balance so a future administration will have plenty of options of future capabilities to choose from if the threats change and if they need to buy a new capability.
In the C4 corner of the world during budget day, one of the big numbers that jumped out to us was the prospective cyber budget, $14.5 billion. That's $1 billion more than last year's ask. The Department of Defense is increasingly paying attention to cyber as competition with Russia and China goes increasingly digital. All three of those world powers are very well known for their virtual arsenal, and they like to poke and prod each other below that level of armed conflict. Some of the big spending in the cyber ask is for ICAM, Identity, Credential, and Access Management, as well as Zero Trust, a new paradigm for cybersecurity that the department wants to achieve by 2027.
Complicating matters is that Congress has not yet passed the 2024 defense budget 6 months into its fiscal year. It's operated under continuing resolutions that extend the previous year's budget. In addition, a supplemental bill that would aid Ukraine and Israel is stuck in Congress. The Department of Defense budget request is part of the president's own budget request, which will go to Congress. And some numbers will change in committee, but the top line number will remain the same because it was capped last year as part of the spending deal. Once Congress passes the bill, a version of it will head to the president's desk. Reporting from the Pentagon, I'm Daniel Woolfolk.